Millions watched as Jasmine Crockett stood, calm, unshaken, and confronted Chief Justice John Roberts in a congressional hearing that stunned the nation. He looked her dead in the eye and called someone unqualified. Hours later, he claimed it wasn't about her, but Jasmine didn't let it slide. She exposed the truth, leaving the most powerful judge in America cornered, silent, and unable to defend the weight of his own words. Now the country is asking, if she was so unqualified, why was she the only one brave enough to speak the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Room 2175 of the Rayburn House office building had never felt heavier. The marble walls stood silent witnesses to what would become one of the most explosive hearings in congressional memory. The room, packed with reporters, legal scholars, and spectators, buzzed with quiet anticipation. At the center sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his posture regal, his expression unreadable. To his right, seated with calm intensity, was Representative Jasmine Crockett, her black blazer sharply pressed, a small gold cross gleaming at her neck, and a folder thick with documents in her hands. She waited for her turn, her eyes not on the cameras, not even on her notes, but fixed directly on the man whose decisions had shaped the nation's most powerful court. When her name was called, she rose slowly, as if stepping into combat. "Mr. Chief Justice," she began, voice steady but firm, "I believe the American people deserve to know if the Supreme Court still answers to the law, or to the donors behind closed doors." There was a flicker of something behind Robert's eyes, a twitch maybe, or just the ghost of a smirk. But he said nothing. Jasmine continued, flipping open the folder. "You've accepted invitations to private retreats funded by groups who later filed amicus briefs in front of your court. You've failed to disclose gifts that, by any civilian standard, would raise red flags. And yet, this body is told to trust that your honor is its own safeguard?" The room grew stiller with every word. When lower courts are bound by codes of conduct, but the highest court is not, that's not balance. That's untouchable power. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried with the weight of every voice that had gone unheard in front of that court. She laid down one final statement like a gavel strike. "Isn't justice supposed to be blind, not selectively mute?" Robert slowly adjusted his mic, pausing as if calculating the exact weight of what he would say next. His hands folded neatly before him, a gesture rehearsed in decades of courtroom decorum. When he finally spoke, it was not in outrage nor in haste. His tone was surgical, cold and smooth. "Congresswoman," he said, locking eyes with her, "I don't believe individuals who have not earned the requisite legal and constitutional gravitas should attempt to lecture the Supreme Court on ethics." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Then came the line that detonated the room. "Frankly, I don't think people who are unqualified should be preaching morality to the High Court." The silence didn't just linger, it took over. It settled into the corners of the room like fog, thick and unmoving, pressing down on every breath, every blink, every thought. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for attention. It demanded it. No one in room 2175 dared to speak. Not the aides, not the chairperson, not even the reporters, whose fingers hovered motionless above their keyboards, too stunned to type. The weight of Robert's words still hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. Unqualified. A single word that cracked through the air like a gunshot muffled in velvet, calculated enough to wound, but vague enough to escape consequence. All eyes, instinctively and silently, turned to Jasmine Crockett, because in that lineup of polished suits, flag pins, and congressional authority, she was the only black woman seated at the dais. And now the room was waiting to see if she would erupt, fold, or disappear. But she didn't do any of that. She sat completely still, unmoving, unbothered, unreadable. Her shoulders didn't stiffen. Her hands didn't ball into fists. Instead, she lowered her eyes back to her documents, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than any voice. One by one, she flipped to the next page in her binder, with the kind of casual care that made everyone else in the room suddenly aware of how hard they were holding their breath. She picked up her pen and calmly resumed writing something in the margin, as if nothing had been said at all. As if the most powerful judge in the country hadn't just tried to publicly reduce her to silence with one backhanded sentence. Her face remained perfectly composed, but her silence wasn't retreat. It was control. It was the kind of control that came from surviving rooms colder than this one, crueler than this one, far more dishonest than this one. 10 seconds passed, but in the world of live politics, 10 seconds of silence might as well be an eternity. People shifted in their seats. The tension became a character in the room. Even Chief Justice Roberts subtly adjusted the clasp of his hands, as if the chill in her silence had reached him too. And then finally she moved. With a precision so deliberate it felt like choreography, Jasmine placed her pen down beside her notepad. She lifted her head, not quickly, not with flair, but with the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Her eyes met his. No tremble, no heat, no panic. Her expression wasn't anger. It was something colder, something that spoke of years of being underestimated, of being questioned, of being measured by standards that shifted every time she rose to meet them. "Chief Justice," she said, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel through silk. "For the sake of clarity, because clarity matters in a courtroom, doesn't it?" She let the question hang, rhetorical but weighted. "When you said, 'I don't think people who are unqualified should preach morality to the High Court,' I'd like to ask you directly." Her eyes didn't blink. "Were you referring to me?" She waited, but not long. "Because when I look around this room, I don't see anyone else who meets the description your eyes were locked on when you said it." And then, one final line, soft as a whisper, but sharper than any gavel. "So I'll ask again, Chief Justice, did you mean me?" The question had been asked with terrifying clarity, and now it hovered in the air like a guillotine suspended by silence. "Did you mean me?" Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. Her calmness was a loaded gun on the table, one everyone could see but no one dared touch. And yet, instead of meeting the moment with honesty, or even with the kind of veiled dignity that had kept him above political noise for decades, Chief Justice John Roberts reached for the safest defense in the book: deflection. He leaned slightly forward, fingers laced, tone polished and deliberately vague. "My statement was meant to reflect general standard," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, like marble covering rot. "It was not directed at any particular individual." The words sounded clean, but they were slippery, designed not to answer, but to escape. The problem was, the room had seen it. Everyone had. The timing, the angle of his eyes, the way the sentence had landed, like a scalpel aimed with surgical intent. And now, here he was, pretending it was academic, pretending it was theoretical, pretending that the blade hadn't just sliced across the only black woman in the room, right in front of an entire nation. Jasmine sat motionless for a breath, then another, and then she leaned forward. Just a bit. Enough to close the distance without threatening, enough to speak not with force but with precision. "Chief Justice," she said, "I asked a question, and instead of answering it, you stepped behind a wall of abstraction and hoped we'd all politely nod." Her voice remained steady, her face unreadable, but her words struck with the weight of stone. "That's not clarity. That's cowardice dressed up in legal syntax." Roberts blinked, once, twice. His fingers shifted slightly on the table. The man who had stood before presidents, who had wielded words like instruments in landmark rulings, was now staring at a woman half his age who refused to flinch, who refused to be gaslit into silence. "If this were a courtroom," Jasmine continued, voice unwavering, "you would demand an answer on the record. And yet here, in front of Congress, you dodge with semantics." Her eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with something more dangerous: focus. "If I, as a sitting member of this body, can be targeted, intentionally or not, and the moment I press for clarity, the Chief Justice hides behind vague principles, then what does that say to every person who doesn't have a microphone in front of them?" The tension in the room tightened like a rope pulled taut across opposing ships. No one looked away. No one breathed too loud. And Roberts hesitated, His reply came slower now, no longer lined with confidence. "Congresswoman, I believe you may have misunderstood," he began, but even he seemed unsure of where the sentence was going. It trailed slightly at the edges, unconvincing even to his own ears. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't need to, because the power had already moved. The balance had already shifted. For the first time in the hearing, Roberts wasn't the one commanding the space. He was defending himself inside it, and the rest of the room knew it too. The chairman didn't gavel, the aides didn't murmur. The press gallery remained frozen. It wasn't decorum holding them still. It was gravity. The gravity of watching a moment that wasn't just about Robert's words or Jasmine's question. It was about what happened when someone who had always been on the outside walked into the most sacred hall of American power and refused to be quiet. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was forming, and every person in that room could feel it coming. She had given him every chance. She had asked the question with precision, waited through the silence, even endured the deflection. But now Jasmine Crockett was done waiting. With a calmness that felt more dangerous than any raised voice, she reached down, tapped her tablet, and brought it to life. The glow of the screen reflected off her hands as rows of information unfolded, tidy columns of names, dates, and monetary figures, each one a thread in a web few had dared to pull. Slowly, deliberately, she turned the tablet toward the committee. The room leaned in. "Let's not talk in circles," she said. "Let's look at some facts." Her voice was even, but it had changed. There was an edge now, like someone tired of asking for permission to be heard. She scrolled down the screen without looking away from Roberts. "The Liberty Civic Foundation," she began. "You gave a speech at their retreat in Aspen on June 14th. 3 months later, they filed a legal brief in the Randall versus Zenith case, which your court ruled on, and you voted in their favor. Would you like to tell this committee who paid for your travel and hotel during that event? Because, according to their own financial records, they covered everything for special judicial guests." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed like a weight, slow and deliberate. "That ruling changed environmental laws across the country, and now we find out that the group who benefited flew the Chief Justice out to a private resort to talk behind closed doors." She tapped again. Another entry came up. "Let's talk about Forward Horizons," she said. "July 9th, Washington, D.C. Hilton, a private legal summit. You were the keynote speaker. On the invite list were CEOs from 5 major tech companies. All of them had cases coming up in federal court." She paused just long enough for the silence to bite. "Do you think it's wrong to ask why a Supreme Court justice is spending weekends talking privately with people whose companies have lawsuits that depend on your vote?" Her words were steady, her face unreadable, but the force behind her calm was unmistakable. "Tell me this," she continued, eyes locked on his. "Who exactly is the one that's not qualified? The person bringing these details forward? Or the one whose name keeps showing up at meetings with billion-dollar interests, and then shows up again in rulings that help those same interests?" Her voice was cool, her delivery clean. "Because if asking these questions makes me unqualified, then maybe what you're really saying is, people like me shouldn't be asking them at all." The next slide lit up. "Here's a flight log from October, a private jet registered to Crestview Holdings. They were involved in a major commerce case your court chose not to hear. Just days before that decision, you attended a private event sponsored by that same company in Arizona." She raised an eyebrow. "Should we believe that's just a coincidence?" She leaned in just slightly. "This isn't guesswork. It's public records. It's your name, their money, your vote, and a pattern that keeps repeating." Another pause. Her voice softened, but cut deeper. "So if you think I'm the one who doesn't belong here, then tell me, does being qualified mean staying quiet while all this goes on?" She lowered her voice one last time, almost to a whisper, but it carried through the room like a drum beat. "Because from where I sit, being qualified means having the guts to ask the questions no one else will." And then she said nothing more, because she didn't need to. The truth had already spoken. The silence no longer belonged to Roberts. It belonged to her. Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved an inch since she began reading. She didn't need to. The weight of her words did the moving for her. Across the long, polished hearing table, Chief Justice John Roberts sat completely still, but something beneath the surface had shifted. His grip on the edge of his chair had tightened visibly, his fingers white at the knuckles. The skin stretched taut like a man trying to anchor himself in a storm he could no longer control. The mask of judicial confidence, the practiced neutrality, the carefully measured tone, was cracking in slow motion. His shoulders, once squared in pride, had begun to draw inward ever so slightly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. Because Jasmine wasn't making accusations. She was unearthing evidence. And with every line she read, another inch of the myth surrounding him was peeled away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pound the table. There was no need for theatrics. She simply scrolled, paused, and read. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but what came out of her mouth had the precision of a scalpel and the weight of a sledgehammer. June 14th, she began again. Aspen, Colorado. You spoke at a retreat held by the Liberty Civic Foundation. They flew you in, covered all your expenses through a donor fund. Then 3 months later, they submitted a brief to the court in the Randall versus Zenith case, and you voted in their favor. She turned a page. July 9th, you attended a private summit at the D.C. Hilton, hosted by Forward Horizons. Tech executives with cases before your court were there. You gave the keynote speech. Their group reimbursed your travel. That's not guessing, that's paperwork. She looked up just for a second, long enough to meet his eyes and make sure he was still listening. Really listening. He was. His jaw was tight now, mouth closed so firmly it looked like he was holding something in. But there was nothing left to hold. She looked back down. October 2nd, she continued. Scottsdale, Arizona. Crestview Holdings hosted an event. You flew there on their private jet. Tail number 5, XKZL. 3 days later, the court refused to hear Fletcher versus Commerce, a case that directly affected Crestview's business. You were the final vote in that decision. Jasmine paused, not because she was unsure, but because she knew the weight of silence now belonged to her too. Then softly she continued. May 18th. You were a guest at a Rhodes Civic Trust dinner in Chicago. That group funded a brief for Trent Veer, federal commission case, ruled on by your court a few weeks later. Again, 5-4. Again, your vote made the difference. She closed the screen for a moment, folded her hands and rested them gently on the table. Not a single word had been shouted, but the hearing room now felt as if it were made of glass, tight, fragile, one sharp movement away from shattering. Still, Robert said nothing. His face was pale now, his hands clasped tighter, elbows resting more heavily against the leather arms of his chair. And Jasmine? Jasmine didn't even smile. She wasn't performing. She wasn't campaigning. She was stating what needed to be heard, in the one place where it was hardest to say it. Her restraint was more powerful than outrage, her facts more devastating than accusations, and she knew it. So tell me, Chief Justice, she said finally, her voice steady, clear, and quiet enough to make the room lean in. When you told me I wasn't qualified to talk about ethics, was that really about qualifications? She let that question hang, not for effect, but because sometimes the silence after truth is louder than anything else. The silence didn't crack. It didn't shift. It settled, like dust after an explosion, like the breath held too long in a room that had forgotten how to exhale. For several long suspended moments, no one moved. Not the clerks, not the aides, not the rows of lawmakers flanking the dais. All eyes remained locked on the space between Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts, where something irreversible had just unfolded. He had come into that room cloaked in tradition, carrying the weight of an institution that rarely gets questioned, much less cornered. But now that cloak looked thinner, almost transparent, and the weight felt like it had shifted shoulders. Roberts was no longer the man asking questions. He was the man answering them, or at least the man trying not to. And everyone in the room could feel the imbalance shift like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't needed to. She had done what no gavel or robe or chamber rule could accomplish. She had changed the gravity of the room. What began as an exchange between a justice and a congresswoman had become something far more raw, far more dangerous, a reckoning. And when she finally spoke again, It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, tired maybe, but deeply rooted in something that had taken a lifetime to form. Her voice was steady and low, the kind of tone that forces people to lean in, not to hear better, but to feel what's behind the words. If our definition of ethics, she said slowly, is something that keeps people like me out, people who ask uncomfortable questions, who come from places not built for power, then maybe it's not a definition worth protecting. She let that sit, not for applause, not for acknowledgement, but because sometimes the truth has to be held in silence so its shape can be fully understood. Her eyes didn't leave Robert's. Her tone didn't soften. But what came next felt less like a challenge and more like a quiet revelation. If calling for transparency makes me unqualified, she said, each word clear, then we've forgotten what qualification is supposed to mean. Her hands rested still on the table. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't performing. She was just telling the truth, the kind that no room, no robe, no title can fully prepare for. Maybe being qualified doesn't mean being approved by the old rules. Maybe it means being brave enough to question them, especially when those rules have never protected people like me. No one dared interrupt. Even the creak of leather chairs had stopped. The chairman, stoic until now, glanced down, nodded once, and said nothing. Not because he had nothing to add, but because nothing needed to be added. The air was thick with understanding, a kind of invisible agreement that what had just happened wasn't routine, wasn't procedural. It was real. The kind of moment that rewrites where power sits in a room. There were no cameras flashing, no clapping hands, no breaking news banners just yet. But something fundamental had already changed, not just in the hearing, but in every person who had watched what Jasmine Crockett just did. She didn't flip the table. She didn't burn the institution. She just held it accountable. And in doing so, reminded the entire room what real qualification looks like. The words had landed, the balance had shifted, and the silence had taken on a new weight. But just as the room began to adjust to that gravity, Chief Justice John Roberts stirred. Slowly, as if he'd felt the tide turn too late, he leaned toward his microphone. His movements were smaller now, more hesitant, measured not in confidence but in damage control. The tone in his voice had lost its marble polish. It was uncertain, brittle around the edges. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, clearing his throat as though it might wash away the moment. I acknowledge that my earlier remark could have been phrased more carefully. It was not my intention to cause offense. A pause and then, the truth is, I was referring to someone else, a staff legal advisor, not you. He said it quietly, like someone hoping a softer delivery would soften the blow. But no one in the room exhaled. No one leaned back in relief, because what he had just offered wasn't a resolution, it was a retreat. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. Her brow furrowed, but not with surprise. She had seen this move before. A man of power speaking in technicalities, hoping ambiguity would patch the wound that clarity had opened. She didn't rush to respond. She let the words hang in the air, rot in it. Then calmly, with precision, she leaned forward and answered in a tone so even, it carried the sharpness of a knife still in its sheath. Chief Justice, she said, her voice steady, what you just said, that actually makes it worse. Her words didn't explode. They landed, soft, controlled, but devastating. Because if you weren't talking about me, then you knew I misunderstood. You watched as I responded to what I believed was an attack on my character, on my integrity, and you said nothing. She paused, not to dramatize, but to let the truth sink like an anchor. You let me take the hit. You let the insult live in the room, and you didn't step in to correct it. Not when the whole country was watching. Not when I had to stand here and defend my right to even be sitting in this chair. Her hands remained still on the table. She didn't need to gesture. The room was already holding its breath. Then came the moment that no one expected. But that changed everything. One of the committee aides, seated near the media monitors, quietly turned the volume up on a screen replaying the live stream. It was muted, but everyone could see the image. The timestamp was clear. The camera angle was fixed. And there he was, Chief Justice Roberts, leaning forward, making the exact statement in question. And his eyes? Locked directly on Jasmine Crockett. Not glancing, not casual, focused, deliberate. The truth wasn't in what he said, it was in who he said it to. No one needed the audio. The footage said everything. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Her silence in that moment wasn't surrender. It was confirmation. It was the kind of silence you only offer when the evidence has spoken louder than you ever could. The kind of silence that doesn't need a closing argument because the facts have already reached their destination. Slowly, she turned her head toward Roberts, and for the first time since he had arrived, his composure faltered. His shoulders tensed. His eyes flickered down toward the table. His mouth tightened, but no words came. What apology could survive a moment like that? Then Jasmine spoke, quietly, and with the full weight of everything that had just unfolded. "You watched me get targeted by your words," she said, "and you chose to let me carry that weight alone." Her voice was soft, but every syllable hit like stone dropped into still water. "And now, after all that, you want to pretend it wasn't about me?" She paused. "You didn't just say something careless. You let the lie grow, and you let me bleed for it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse him of anything beyond what everyone had already seen. She simply named the silence, named the moment, named the failure. And the room responded not with shock, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that follows when people realize they've just watched someone refuse to be erased. And then came the silence, the real silence. Not the uncomfortable pause between arguments, not the breath before rebuttal, but the silence that settles like dust after something breaks. A silence that no apology could clean up. A silence that no clarification could reverse. The kind of silence that makes people look at power differently because they've seen it blink, seen it stammer, seen it try to rewrite its own intent and fail. Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't press. She simply looked back down at her notes, tapped her tablet screen once, and closed the file. Her job was done. She hadn't come to perform. She came to hold someone accountable. And now everyone in the room, on the dais, in the gallery, behind the cameras, understood exactly what had just happened. The most powerful judge in the country had spoken, but it was her silence that echoed. The silence after the live stream replay wasn't just damning, it was complete. The illusion had shattered, the footage had spoken, and for the first time that morning, John Roberts no longer looked like a man in control of the room. He looked like a man who had just watched a mask fall and didn't know how to put it back on. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting just across from him, didn't move to twist the knife. Instead, she turned inward, her expression shifting not to triumph, but to memory. Her posture straightened, her eyes lowered for a beat, and then she looked up, not at him this time, but past him, past the cameras, past the polished mahogany panels and into something deeper, older, harder. She spoke not to win the moment, but to tell the truth of how she got here. "There's something you should know," she began, her voice lower now, not quiet but full of weight. "When I was 19, I was arrested for the first time. The room didn't move, not a whisper, not a rustle. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't stealing, I wasn't causing chaos. I was standing outside a courthouse in Dallas, protesting the sentencing of a teenage boy, black like me, who'd been given 25 years for stealing a jacket. A jacket. While a white boy from a private school down the road got probation for assault, I held a sign. I chanted his name, and that's all it took." Her eyes didn't blink. Her jaw didn't shake. She was calm, but in the way a storm is calm just before the break. "They told me I was trespassing. They said I was disruptive. They cuffed me and pushed me into a cruiser like I was dangerous. My mom didn't have money for a lawyer. We didn't have friends in the system. All we had was our last name, and that didn't mean much." She exhaled slowly. "The charges were dropped eventually, but the record stayed. For years. Every internship I applied for, every job I interviewed for. That arrest came up first, before my GPA, before my class rank, before me." The tension in the room was no longer between her and Roberts. It was between her past and their perception. That moment changed me. It didn't make me angry. It made me determined. I didn't go to law school to become part of the system that did that to me. I went to law school so I could take that system apart and rebuild it in the name of people who never get to speak in rooms like this one. Her voice grew more measured with every word. I studied not just to argue the law, but to understand its cracks, the gaps where bias hides, the corners where silence protects the powerful and buries the vulnerable. She leaned forward, not for emphasis, but because the weight of what she was saying demanded proximity. You see, people like me, we're told we're not enough before we even start. Too loud, too emotional, too angry, too black, and always, always too unqualified. So I know exactly what it means when a man in power looks across the room at a woman like me and uses those words. I've heard them since I was a child. She turned back to Roberts, now meeting his gaze fully again. I've lived a whole life being told I don't belong. But today I'm the one sitting behind this microphone. And the man who questioned my place, he's the one hiding behind a robe. The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They just sat there, massive and still, like stone blocks dropped onto marble floors. Across the table, Robert's face was unreadable, but not cold. Not anymore. The chill that had once lingered in his expression was gone, replaced by something far more difficult to process. Hollowness. He didn't blink. He didn't frown. His face had softened in a way that suggested not realization, but resignation, as if he'd finally felt the size of the moment and knew he couldn't rise to meet it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't press the advantage. She simply let her words settle in the room, heavy as justice that had waited too long. Her eyes dropped back to her notes, but she didn't read them. Her hand hovered above the page like she was still living in that memory, still holding the sign outside that courthouse. Still 19, still cuffed. But now she was here, and everything she had fought through, the arrest, the doubt, the rooms where she wasn't welcome, had led to this one. I didn't come here today to be comfortable, she said at last, her voice softening. I came here to be honest. And nothing in that room could stand against it. The room was still holding its breath from the weight of her story. Every syllable Jasmine Crockett had spoken, about being cuffed for protesting injustice, about clawing her way into the law not to belong to it, but to challenge it, had settled into the air like dust that refused to be swept away. Chief Justice Roberts hadn't responded, couldn't. His silence now was no longer commanding. It was revealing. The power that once wrapped around him like armor had faded, leaving only the outline of a man who once controlled every room he entered. Now he was motionless, stuck inside the hollow echo of what he hadn't said, of what he had let happen. And Jasmine, across from him, didn't look triumphant. She looked finished, not exhausted, complete. She didn't need anything more from him. Not an apology, not a gesture, not a correction, because what needed to be said had already been said. She didn't reach for her notes. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't make any move that would dull the final edge of what she was about to leave behind. Instead, she straightened in her chair, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet resolve that felt older than the institution itself. Her hands rested on the table one last time. Then she rose, gracefully, deliberately, standing not as someone concluding a hearing, but as someone stepping out of a fire she had walked through on her own terms. The movement itself sent a wave through the room, like a shift in pressure that made everyone suddenly aware of their posture, their silence, their complicity. Every person in that chamber knew they were witnessing something that would not be forgotten, something that couldn't be undone. Jasmine's eyes didn't linger on Roberts. She didn't wait for him to look up. Instead, she spoke clearly, not to him, not to the committee, but to history. Her voice was calm, firm, and final. Being qualified, she said, isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you. There was no tremble in her tone, no hesitation, just the cold, undeniable truth of someone who had lived every inch of that sentence. She wasn't asking for permission. She was claiming space, space that generations before her had been denied, and that she now stood in fully, without apology. Her words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They carved themselves into the silence, into the walls, into the memory of every person sitting in that chamber. She didn't look back at Roberts to see if he understood, because it no longer mattered if he did. The moment had passed him. The country had seen it, and Jasmine Crockett had already moved on from it. Not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had told the truth in a place built to obscure it, and stood tall when others stayed seated. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, packed with everything no one dared say out loud. No murmurs, no movement. No one shifted in their seat or reached for a pen. Even the chairman, who had gavel authority, didn't speak, didn't blink. The entire hearing room, so used to noise, to arguments, to carefully scripted power plays, was now still, respectfully still. Not out of politeness, but out of awe, because they all knew what had just happened. The person who had been questioned, dismissed, underestimated, targeted, had left standing, not metaphorically, literally, while the most powerful judicial figure in the country remained frozen in his chair, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on a table that no longer offered him protection. Jasmine didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need a soundbite for the cameras. What she needed, she had already given herself: the truth. And in that moment, that truth was all that mattered. It stood taller than the dais, louder than the gavel, more enduring than the robes. She walked slowly, not with the stiffness of confrontation, but with the confidence of closure. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step a punctuation mark that needed no translation. Each step said, "I am not afraid of these walls. I do not owe them anything, and I do not need them to recognize my worth." Behind her, Roberts remained seated, his face unreadable, his hands still folded, tighter now. But it wasn't dignity that kept him in that seat. It was weight, the weight of a silence that had arrived too late, the weight of a robe that no longer shielded him, the weight of being watched, not as a guardian of law, but as a man who had been given the chance to stand for something and chose not to. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. And perhaps, most telling of all, he didn't deny what had just happened. Because how could he? The country had seen it, live, unfiltered, in real time. Outside the chamber, the buzz was already beginning. Whispers in hallways, texts lighting up screens, journalists blinking in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. But inside room 2175, none of that noise had arrived yet. Inside, there was only the sound of a woman's footsteps growing fainter as she walked away from the table, and a nation's understanding growing louder in her wake. She didn't turn back. Not once. Because people who know where they stand never have to look behind them. And Roberts, he never left his seat. But everyone watching knew exactly who had just stood up. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echo felt deafening. Inside room 2175, the stillness remained, almost sacred. Outside, however, the world had already begun to move. Jasmine didn't stop walking. Not for cameras, not for whispers, not even for the security detail that instinctively fell in beside her. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble corridor of the Rayburn House office building. Each step sounded louder than it should have, as if the building itself were listening. Her eyes were forward, her face calm. But behind her, a storm was gathering, not of weather, but of attention. The moment she turned the final corner into the main hallway, it hit her, not the press, not the chaos, the quiet. A crowd had formed, but there was no shouting, no frenzy, no flashbulbs, just a wave of bodies, staffers, reporters, passers-by, who parted to let her through, not because they were told to, but because something in them knew they had just witnessed history. Someone held up a phone, live streaming. She caught the words on the screen for just a second. She stood up. Another reporter whispered, not to her, but to a producer beside them, "I've never seen a hearing end like that." Still no one spoke directly to Jasmine, not yet. It was as if the power she carried hadn't fully dissipated from the room and was still radiating off her skin like heat after fire. Outside the building, the story had already exploded. On social media, the clip of her final statement was being reshared at dizzying speed. The moment she stood, the calm in her voice, the weight of her last words, being qualified isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you. Were already subtitled in a dozen languages. The image of her standing while Roberts sat frozen in place became an instant symbol. Someone posted a split screen. Her rising, him sinking. The caption read, "Truth doesn't wear robes." In a dorm room at Howard University, a freshman law student named Erica paused her exam prep to watch the clip. She didn't blink. She didn't move. When it ended, she whispered, "That's it. That's the reason I'm here." In a break room at a Chicago factory, a 58-year-old machinist who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before leaned forward toward the small TV and muttered, "Damn, that woman's got steel in her bones." In a news studio in New York, producers yelled over one another, "Clear the 6:30, this goes top of show." In a coffee shop in Oakland, in a courthouse in Philadelphia, in a mother's kitchen in Atlanta, people watched, and then they shared. Not just the clip, not just the quote, their stories. Watched a black woman take down the highest judge in the country with nothing but truth. I'm crying. I was told I wasn't qualified because of where I came from. Today I watched someone prove otherwise. My daughter just asked me what it means to be qualified. I showed her Jasmine's clip. She smiled for the first time in a week. By the time Jasmine reached the Capitol Rotunda, her phone had buzzed 31 times. She hadn't looked at it once. Inside the hearing room, staffers had begun to pack up. But something was different now. They moved more slowly, more carefully, like cleaning up after something sacred, not procedural. One junior staffer, new to the Hill, barely out of grad school, stood holding his folder, staring at Roberts. Not with anger, with awe, not at the Chief Justice, at the silence Jasmine had left behind. The silence that said, "Everything has changed now." Roberts hadn't moved. In the minutes after Jasmine left, he sat motionless, his hands still clasped in front of him, his eyes blank. The power that had once wrapped around him like a second skin had cracked, not by force, but by truth. A truth too calm to ignore, too still to deny. And it was spreading. CNN broke into programming. Developing now, a congressional hearing erupts into one of the most powerful moments in recent political memory. MSNBC. Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Chief Justice Roberts wasn't just political, it was personal. It was history. Fox News treaded carefully. Controversial exchange between Supreme Court Justice and Congresswoman draws fire, both ways. But even they couldn't avoid the visual. A woman rising, a man not responding. By evening, Shuck Crockett vs. Roberts had trended #1 worldwide. It was no longer a hearing, it was a reckoning. Back in her office, Jasmine finally sat down. The noise had reached the walls, but not her heart. Not yet. Her chief of staff placed a laptop in front of her, already queued with footage of the moment. Jasmine didn't press play. She already knew what happened. Instead, she looked out the window. The sky over Washington had shifted into a soft orange, dusk beginning to settle over the city like a sigh. For the first time that day, she exhaled, long, full, and quiet. She didn't feel victorious. That wasn't the word. She felt true, and that was enough. Across the country, it wasn't the words people remembered first. It was the stillness, the way she stood, the way she didn't ask to be respected. She demanded it without ever raising her voice. That stillness was being replayed in school assemblies, in living rooms, in college campuses, in union halls. People weren't just watching the wave. They were becoming it. In downtown Detroit, a group of young activists began printing posters that read, "She stood, so we will." In Tulsa, Oklahoma, a pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon, title, "When Standing is the Only Answer." In Sacramento, an 11-year-old girl opened her school presentation with Jasmine's quote about being qualified. Her teacher cried. Jasmine hadn't set out to spark a movement. But then again, most movements aren't sparked by speeches. They're sparked by moments, when someone refuses to sit down. And this wasn't just a moment, it was a wave. And it was only beginning. They called it the moment that broke the robe. Not officially, of course. Not in legal briefs or committee reports. But across the country, in living rooms, lecture halls, barber shops, courthouse lobbies, Newsroom roundtables? People said it the way survivors speak of the moment a storm split the sky. And as the clip of Jasmine Crockett standing before Chief Justice John Roberts reached its 100 millionth view, America wasn't just reacting with admiration, it was dividing. The backlash came fast, but not in the way people expected. It didn't come for her, it came for him. Within 24 hours, the Supreme Court's Public Information Office released a terse, three-line statement. Chief Justice Roberts acknowledges the misunderstanding during the April 22nd hearing. He affirms his respect for all members of Congress and regrets any confusion that may have resulted. It landed with a dull thud. No apology, no ownership, just cold, bureaucratic distance. The internet didn't miss it. Regrets confusion, one headline read. He wasn't confused, he was caught. What followed was something far more intense than a PR blunder. It was an unraveling. At law schools across the country, professors scrapped their scheduled lectures to break down the hearing, frame by frame. Students stood up in crowded lecture halls and read Jasmine's words aloud, not as testimony, but as manifesto. In a viral TikTok, a law student from Howard said, "They've been teaching us legal ethics as if it were sacred. But what we just saw, that's what happens when you ask power to follow its own rules." Meanwhile, the legal blogosphere detonated. SCOTUS Watch published a searing editorial titled, "A Robe is Not a Shield, and It Never Should Have Been." An ethics professor from Yale wrote a thread viewed 10 million times. What Roberts failed to say, failed to own, failed to see, isn't just a mistake, it's a mirror, and America saw what it reflects. Even the normally reserved American Bar Association released a cautious statement. Recent events highlight the urgent need for a binding ethical code applicable to all justices. Then came the calls from Congress. Representative Mark Caldwell, a centrist Democrat from Illinois, issued a demand for a formal inquiry into Roberts' ties to private interest groups mentioned during the hearing. What began as a symbolic gesture turned into something bigger when 3 Republicans, under pressure from constituents, broke ranks and backed it. Cable news split down ideological lines, but even conservative anchors struggled to defend what the country had seen. Fox's top legal analyst admitted, even if you believe Roberts didn't intend the insult for Congresswoman Crockett, the failure to correct the perception in real time, that was devastating. He didn't just look arrogant, he looked afraid. On MSNBC, the framing was sharper. She stood up. He sat down. That's all the history books will remember. But not everyone was celebrating. In the darker corners of the internet, a predictable wave of attacks was unleashed on Jasmine. Some tried to paint her as disrespectful, grandstanding, or ungrateful. Others resurrected tired tropes, too emotional, too aggressive, too loud. A few anonymous sources leaked selectively edited clips, hoping to recast her as combative, unprofessional. But the effort didn't gain traction, because this time, the truth had receipts, and 100 million people had already seen them. The real backlash, the one that stuck, wasn't aimed at Jasmine's tone. It was aimed at the Supreme Court itself. For decades, the highest court in the land had operated without a formal ethics code. Justices weren't required to disclose many private meetings, honorariums, or trips. They were bound by personal discretion. But Jasmine's questions had turned discretion into exposure. Her tablet didn't just contain dates and names, it contained precedent. Now the country wanted answers. An independent watchdog group filed a formal Freedom of Information Act request seeking travel records for all 9 justices. The Washington Post's investigative unit began a series titled Justice and Influence, digging into years of private retreats and off-the-record legal summits. And in a stunning move, Senator Amy Grayson, a moderate with deep ties to the judiciary, announced bipartisan legislation, the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act. It would mandate mandatory annual disclosures for Supreme Court justices, ban gifts or trips paid for by organizations with pending cases, and create an independent ethics oversight board. Its nickname on the Hill? The Crockett Clause. In a press conference, Senator Grayson didn't mince words. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just call out a moment. She exposed a pattern. This isn't about vengeance. It's about accountability. Roberts, for his part, remained silent. No televised statements, no follow-up testimony, no media appearances. But silence wasn't protection anymore. Not when the country had seen him stare down a woman speaking truth, say nothing, and then claim it wasn't about her. The damage wasn't just reputational, it was institutional. Confidence in the Supreme Court plummeted to a record low, 41%, according to Gallup. In the legal community, something deeper shifted. Young lawyers began citing Crockett's hearing not just as commentary, but as case study. Professors across the country rewrote sections of their ethics curriculum. Legal podcasts debated the line between deference and duty. And in every corner of the culture, the phrase "she stood, he sat" became something more than a recap. It became a standard. One night, 2 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine appeared on a quiet late-night interview show. Not for a political panel, not for a campaign, just her, a chair, a microphone. The host asked gently, "Do you regret anything about that day?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. "No, because if I hadn't stood up, I would have carried that silence for the rest of my life. And I'm done carrying things that don't belong to me." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. They sat in that truth the way the country had sat with it the day she stood up. And somewhere across a city, or maybe across the country, someone was watching who had once been told they were unqualified. And in that moment, they knew. They weren't. They were just beginning. Months had passed since Jasmine Crockett stood in that hearing room and shifted the axis of power with a single sentence. The world had not stood still in the wake of her words, but it had changed direction. The Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act, once thought too bold, too confrontational, had passed the House with bipartisan support and cleared the Senate in a nail-biting 52-48 vote. For the first time in U.S. history, Supreme Court justices would be subject to legally binding ethics rules. The new oversight body created under the Act bore a name no one could ignore: the Crockett Commission on Judicial Accountability. It wasn't something Jasmine had asked for. She hadn't drafted the legislation. She hadn't campaigned for her name to be on it. But the truth was undeniable. She had earned it. Across the country, the moment she had stood was now part of something bigger than media cycles and trending hashtags. It had become curriculum. In law schools from Harvard to Howard, students analyzed the hearing not just for its legal implications, but for its moral architecture. One professor at Stanford opened her first lecture with a looped clip of Jasmine's now iconic line: "Being qualified isn't something you're given because of your title. It's something you prove with your choices, even when no one is standing beside you." She paused the video and said, "This is what integrity looks like. This is what resistance to institutional inertia sounds like. And this is why we're here." In courtrooms across America, young lawyers now cited the Crockett precedent in ethical challenge motions. Not a ruling, not a case, a moment, a statement, a stand. For many, Jasmine had become a symbol, but she refused to let herself be turned into an ornament. She kept showing up, quietly, consistently. Not for photo ops, not for interviews, but for people. She returned to the university where she had been arrested at 19 and gave a closed-door seminar to students of color entering pre-law. She told them, "The law will never love you, but that doesn't mean you don't belong inside it." She declined national awards. She rejected endorsement deals. But she accepted a small invitation from a community legal aid group in Flint, Michigan. When asked why she showed up to such a small organization, she said, "Because this is where justice starts. Not in courts, but in places that believe people deserve to be heard before they can afford to be heard." Meanwhile, Roberts never fully recovered. He continued his duties on the bench, but his presence in public life diminished. Every opinion he authored was now shadowed by one moment of silence, the day he said nothing when it mattered most. He was still Chief Justice, but to many his title no longer carried the weight it once did. It had been measured, and in that hearing room, found lacking. For Jasmine, though, something more profound had occurred. Her role in the public imagination was no longer just that of a congresswoman. She had become a North Star for what principled leadership looked like in a time of cynicism. In a televised town hall in Philadelphia, A high school student stood and asked her, "Do you ever feel scared?" Jasmine smiled softly and said, "Every day." But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's just refusing to let fear do the talking. The room erupted. She didn't pause for applause. She waited, then finished. And every time you speak truth, even if your voice shakes, you make it easier for the next person to speak. Her words became part of school posters, graduation speeches, tattoo ink, murals on brick walls in neighborhoods that had never seen a politician speak their language, until she did. On the anniversary of the hearing, an artist in Brooklyn unveiled a painting of Jasmine standing beside her seat, back straight, chin lifted. The piece was titled Unrobed. Underneath, a plaque read, "She didn't just stand, she made standing a form of truth." And yet Jasmine never treated it like her moment. In every interview, she deflected credit. She named every name of those who'd come before her, who'd spoken up and been ignored, who'd been crushed by the weight of systems they never built but were forced to carry. She once said on radio, "I stood because so many others didn't get the chance. I'm just the echo of voices this country didn't listen to in time." And perhaps that's why her legacy endured. Not because she changed the system overnight, but because she reminded people they had the right to demand more from it. Because she refused to let titles silence truth. Because she didn't just speak the words, we all saw her live them. And in doing so, she left behind more than policy. She left behind a path, one not paved by approval, not guarded by robes, but cleared by the footsteps of a woman who decided one day to stand and never look back. And so, as the halls emptied and the headlines multiplied, something larger than legislation lingered, something deeper than politics or power. It was the question no camera could capture, no transcript could fully convey. What does it truly mean to be worthy? And who decides? In a world built to reward compliance, Jasmine Crockett did something dangerous. She refused to be quiet. Not in protest, not in outrage, but in truth. Cold, calm, inescapable truth. She didn't demand respect with volume or posture. She didn't beg for dignity. She embodied it. And in doing so, she exposed a fault line that runs through every institution, every courtroom, every boardroom and classroom in America. The myth of merit. The belief that titles and tradition are proof of integrity, that robes are proof of righteousness, that power by nature deserves deference. What Jasmine showed the world, what she made undeniable, is that none of those things are true without accountability. And accountability only exists when someone is brave enough to ask, who gave you that power? And why haven't you earned it? This wasn't just about a courtroom. It wasn't just about a hearing. It was about every woman who's ever walked into a room and been told she didn't belong there because her voice didn't sound right, or her skin didn't look right, or her questions made people uncomfortable. It was about every person who's ever been passed over, looked past, talked down to, and then gaslit when they tried to name it. Jasmine stood not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she knew what it meant to have no one else willing to stand with you. And that's the moral heartbeat of this story. When no one shields you, when no one lifts you up, standing becomes the most radical act you can commit. Justice, real justice, doesn't happen in marble chambers or behind closed doors. It happens when someone demands it, out loud and in full view of those who've spent lifetimes learning how to silence dissent. It happens not when the system reforms itself, but when someone refuses to carry its silence anymore. Jasmine Crockett didn't confront the Chief Justice of the United States. She interrupted a ritual, a centuries-old performance in which power pretends to be neutral, while the rest of the room is expected to play along. She broke that script. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that justice cannot exist where courage is punished and silence is rewarded. But perhaps the most piercing lesson isn't about what she said, it's about what he didn't. John Roberts, a man entrusted with the highest judicial authority in the land, had every chance to clarify, to correct, to protect the dignity of someone wrongly accused, even if it wasn't his intent. But he chose not to, and that choice revealed the most dangerous kind of injustice, the kind that hides behind politeness, the kind that smiles while it denies, the kind that speaks in generalities so it never has to take responsibility. Jasmine named that cowardice for what it was. And in doing so, she exposed a truth far more threatening than corruption. It was apathy in power. And that's the enemy of democracy. This is the story of a woman who was arrested for protesting injustice at 19, and decades later, faced down the most powerful judge in America without flinching. She didn't do it with anger. She did it with memory. She carried every insult, every microaggression, every slammed door, and whispered doubt into that hearing room and turned them into testimony, not for herself, but for every young girl who's ever been told to smile more, for every first-gen law student who's ever been told they don't fit, for every Black woman who's ever been called too much and then too little in the same breath. Jasmine Crockett spoke for all of them, and for once the world listened. The moral of this story is not that power is bad. It's that power without introspection is dangerous. That tradition without truth is a lie. That ethics are not self-assigned, they are proven. And above all, that dignity doesn't flow from robes or gavels or Senate seats. It flows from the willingness to stand for what is right, even when you are standing alone. Because sometimes the robe doesn't symbolize wisdom, it hides from it. And sometimes the person who enters the room with the least protection leaves with the most truth. And so the next time someone says, "You're not qualified," remember this moment. Remember the silence that followed her question, the tremble in power when it was finally forced to look at itself. Remember the woman who stood, not because she was invited, but because she had earned the right to speak through fire. And remember that the world does not change because the powerful allow it. It changes because the brave insist. Qualification is not about pedigree. It's not about proximity to power. It's about what you do when the lights are brightest and the silence is deepest. It's about what you say when no one else will speak. And it's about whether your truth, when spoken aloud, makes the world a little more just or leaves it untouched. Jasmine Crockett made the world shake that day, not with rage, not with spectacle, but with truth. And in that truth, we found something rare. Not just a moment of accountability, but a blueprint for courage. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in the story. Together, our voices make a difference.